Welcome to another episode of PIDE, a podcast series. In this episode, we will talk about the technology trap and the future of work. To have a conversation on this topic, we have Benedikt Frey from Oxford University. Benedikt Frey is a German-Swedish economist and economic historian. He is Oxford Martin City Fellow at Oxford University, where he runs the program on the future of work. Today, we will talk about his latest book, The Technology Trap: Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation. Mr. Karl, first of all, I would like you to introduce us to your book. What is the basic idea of this book, and what inspired you, what compelled you to write on this topic particularly?
So a key theme that runs through the book is that progress isn't natural. If progress was natural, the first industrial revolution would have happened a bit earlier in the history of humanity. If technological progress was automatic and natural, then we would have seen most countries around the world adopt the same technology to the same extent, obviously with some differences due to differences in factory endowments and so on. But broadly speaking, we wouldn't see these vast differences in internet penetration, use of AI, use of robots, various types of technologies. So there seems to be, some hurdles to the adoption of new technologies. And what I argue in the book is that there is such a thing as a technology trap, especially when technology is of the replacing type and threaten people's jobs and skills and livelihoods. So even though we think of technology as something good in terms of increasing productivity over the long run, making new goods and services available to us, allowing us to shift into better paid and more comfortable jobs in air-conditioned offices rather than fields and factories. In the short run, though, if people's jobs and when people's jobs are being replaced, those who sort of live through that episodes are not necessarily the ones reaping the gains from these technologies over the long run. So their opposition to new technologies might make sense. And this was certainly true of the Luddites who rioted against the mechanized factory, famously in Britain, during the first industrial revolution. But that didn't just happen in Britain, right? So the craft guilds were very strong in Europe, but also in East Asia and notably in China. And they resisted new technologies like the gig mill, for example, that threatened to replace them. And the consequence of that is that we are caught in this trap whereby the long-run gains of new technologies might be precluded to future generations because in the short run, and the short run can be a long time, in the first industrial revolution, the wages were stagnant for some 7 decades, as I point out in the book. So that is essentially the technology trap, and that's the key argument of the book.
Mr. Karl, we both know that technology is an expensive thing and only few can afford it. Whether it's individuals or firms or countries, there's a clear divide in this. So don't you think that the dividends will be only for few and only few can reap the benefits of the technology, and others will be left out of this competition or this race or this game in the global arena?
Well, I do think that it's true that innovation can increase inequality, and top income seems to track patterns of patenting quite well, for example. On the other hand, though, I think creative destruction, which is a part of technological change, is quite essential for things like social mobility, because wealth otherwise risks becoming entrenched, and that makes inequality potentially even worse. So as I usually tell my student, the only thing that's worse than technological progress is no technological progress. As I do worry about these inequalities that you do mention, but I think over the long run, they tend to trickle down. People today have access to better medicines in developed parts of the world than royalty had a century ago, right? So over the long run, I'm not particularly concerned, but I'm more concerned about the short-run dynamics.
You have mentioned two ideas in your book. One is short run and one in long run. You said that in the short run, technology replaces the human resource, and in the long run, technology augments the human resource. So, in the long run, I don't see much of the problem, but in the short run, when technology replaces human resource, then there is a problem for human resource. They get unemployed, etc., and the negative consequences after that. So, what do you suggest? What should the countries or the governments or the companies do in the short run, so that they can absorb technology into their systems, but at the same time, no loss for the human resource as well?
Yes, so that's a good question. So in the book, I borrow this basic conceptual framework from 𝘁𝗲𝗰𝗵 and Pascal-Restrepo, distinguishing between replacing and enabling technologies. So one sort of extreme, you can think of the automatic elevator, which did nothing but replacing the operator. So all it did was essentially getting rid of elevator operators, and that would be a clear-cut example of a replacing technology. Or you can think of the telescope, which essentially allowed people to look at the moons of Jupiter, allowed us to do new and previously inconceivable things. And it's very hard to think of a single job that would have been replaced by the invention of the telescope. And then obviously there are a lot of intermediate cases, like the automobile replaced the need for horse carriages, but created huge new industries producing cars, created new occupations for taxi and bus drivers and so on, created complementary demand for road commerce, etc., etc. And some episodes historically have been more replacing, some have been more enabling. I argue in the book that the first industrial revolution was predominantly replacing. What it did is sort of introducing machines and factories to produce textiles more cheaply, something that was already being done. The same is true, I think, of robots today that replaced people in factory work. And essentially, allow us to do existing things more productively rather than creating new types of activities. During the first industrial revolution, though, and I think one of the reasons, several, but one of the reasons that it happened in Britain was that Britain had something that was called the poor laws at the time. It taxed itself some in the era of 2% of GDP annually, and redistributed that income to poor people in need. And what you do see is that in places where the poor laws were more generous in Britain, because there's some geographic variation there are fewer machinery riots. So if you compensate the losers to some degree, and this was very little compensation, that seems to help. And I think one of the reasons that we've seen less resistance to progress over the 20th century has been the development of welfare states and educational institutions that make adjustment easier on behalf of the population. But in addition to that, there are sort of pre-distribution or post-production policies that can be put in place to also potentially shift the direction of technological change. So we favored the development of more enabling technologies rather than replacing ones. So 𝘁𝗲𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗫, for example, has pointed out that the tax code in the US heavily favors automation, in the sense that payroll taxes have been increasing, whereas taxes on capital have been decreasing. And as businesses try to save on the more expensive factor, that means that investing more in technologies that are likely to replace workers, and we could change that potentially through the tax code.
What is your view on the global divide, the North and South, the West and the East, and the developed and the developing countries? Do you think there's a sense of responsibility, ethical or moral or whatever you call it, that Would you suggest that the developed countries should extend a helping hand towards the developing countries in terms of technology adaptation and technology creation and innovation? So what is your view on that?
I think that's an excellent question. So I think if you look at the post-war era, one of the reasons that Europe closed the gap quite rapidly to the US and that Japan and to some extent Korea did the same is that the US was relatively committed to technology transfer in this period through the Marshall Plan and various other initiatives, in large part because of their perceived communist threat. And in the case of Japan, obviously, the Americans were terrified, and that Japan, being shattered from the war, would turn towards the Soviets. So they made production technologies and training programs that actually worked quite well within the US during the war available to their allies as well. That is not to say, though, that America should be getting all the credit for Japanese and European growth. So I think the institutions of Japan and continental Europe, which were latecomers also in the 19th century, follower countries after Britain industrialized, their institutions from then on were essentially already geared towards catch-up. So they worked quite well when it came to absorbing foreign technologies, scale it up swiftly, improve production processes, and use the bureaucratic capacity of the state to help industry scale and solve coordination problems, as well as providing public goods. I do think that there are very good reasons to think that we should do more to reduce hurdles to technology transfer. And I think the patent system has probably been a hurdle here. But at the same time, it's very hard to suggest that advanced economies have a direct role to play in developing domestic institutions in some of these places. So in the end of the day, it's a mix. You need access to technology, but as Moses Abramovich pointed out, you also need the social capabilities to absorb those technologies, and you need to develop those capabilities, I believe, internally.
So Carl, as I was reading through your book, just a thought came into my mind that perhaps technology, particularly the artificial intelligence, don't you think in the future, in the near future or in the distant future, it will provide a level playing field for all the countries or all the firms? For example, Dubai, Oman and Qatar, they have scarce human resource and they depend on the human resource, for example, from Pakistan, from India, from Bangladesh, and they cannot fully function on their own human resource. So do you think that technology replacing the human resource makes them independent from the human resource, and that the small countries with lesser human resource can also compete with those who have more of the human resource? So is that notion that came up, that popped in my mind, a correct one?
So I think there are several parts to the answer. So one is that if you look at the type of jobs that are most likely to be replaced by artificial intelligence, it's not the jobs of doctors and lawyers. So yes, document review is no longer part of billable hours. Machine do that better. And medical diagnostics, AI still perform quite well, but the jobs of doctors and lawyers consist of more than medical diagnostics and document review, right? So certain components of those jobs might be replaced, but not the entire job. Whereas, for example, the entire job of a receptionist or the entire job of a waiter or the entire job of a truck or bus driver might be replaced. And those tend to be jobs for the most part on the lower end of the income distribution, which means that one of the comparative advantages of developing countries, which is cheap labor, is seemingly gradually being diminished. At the same time, though, I do think that as manufacturing in particular is becoming more automated, developing countries do need more to move more into services and preferably tradable services. And if you look at digital platforms for global gig work, you will find that most vacancies are in the US and the UK and Australia and so on. And most work locations will be in India and Philippines and Pakistan and so on. And so it will be in, places with English-speaking populations, because obviously language content matters a lot more, and cultural content should be said as well when it comes to trade and services. And I think artificial intelligence has the potential to bring down those barriers a bit through machine translation, for example, which is getting better. So I think it's a complex picture, and I don't think we have a full handle to what extent AI will level the global playing field or not. There are competing effects, but I think for the most part, if history is any guide, we often see an increase in global inequality when new technologies are first adopted, and then hopefully after that a period of convergence. Unfortunately, though, outside manufacturing, there doesn't seem to be a thing like unconditional convergence. So, local institution, again, to go back to the previous point, do very much interact with the adoption of new technologies. And I think that will also be the case with AI.
It's too much technology. We have seen in industrial revolution that it has positive spillover effects across the globe, but it also has negative consequences. Climate change is one evidence that we can refer here. So, but until now, we didn't know that it would have negative consequences. So now we are mitigating the climate change, and now we are addressing the issue to limit the carbon emissions, etc. So do we have to wait for the technology and artificial intelligence too until it shows negative consequences, or we can indigenize and we can internalize these issues beforehand so that we don't see them at all? So how much technology is too much technology? How much technology should be allowed? Who should regulate it? Do you have some idea in your mind regarding this issue?
It's a great question and not an entirely easy one to answer. So, for example, as you pointed out, one of the negative consequences or negative externalities of the first industrial revolution were huge CO2 emissions. People at the time didn't know that that would lead to global warming and climate change. So often the negative consequences of a new technology are not quite apparent from the outset. You often see this bite back happening years, decades, and in this case, even centuries later. And I think if we are so concerned by every conceivable negative effect that the new technology might have, then we are very unlikely, or at least much less likely, to put them into use. So there's a real risk that that will really stall technological progress, which is, after all, what's been driving the upsurge in growth and improved living standards over the past 2 centuries. I think there's also another concern, which has to do with, if we then decide to regulate, who regulates and who influences the that process. So if you look at regulations like the GDPR, the European Data Privacy Law, For example, we've done some research on that, and it seems that the only companies that haven't really been adversely affected by it has been large tech companies. So big tech, for example, has managed to really offset the compliance costs by capturing a larger share of the market, whereas smaller companies which have fewer resources to be able to comply are able to spend less on lobbying and so influence the regulation. They are the real losers to this. So I think it's, throws up a new set of questions, and some places might be more capable because of better institutions and more dispersed political power, might be better able to regulate than others. So I'm afraid there's not an entirely crisp answer. Unfortunately, I do think that we are unable to foresee the negative effects of most technologies. That doesn't matter that we shouldn't be thinking about it. We clearly should, and there are a lot of people that are engaged in the ethics of AI these days, and worry about even existential risks from artificial intelligence. And I think those things are very worthwhile discussing and debating. But I think it also goes back to the point by which we started this conversation, which is that progress is not automatic, right? And if people don't believe in it, if people believe that the risks outweigh the potential benefits, then we're less likely to have it. And in Europe now, degrowth has become a very popular theme on the left. A disbelief in science and progress has become a popular theme on the right. And so, through just the fact that a large share of the population seemingly no longer believes in progress, which is, after all, if you read somebody like 𝘁𝗲𝗃, was what the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and its connection to the Industrial Revolution was essentially about, then that process can certainly not be taken for granted. So yes, I do worry about us not thinking about the negative consequences, but I also worry about us overthinking.
Mr. Gal, as I was reading through the pages of your book, an interesting thought came across that maybe there's a silver lining in the cloud. Maybe we have lost the human touch with the advent of technology, the cell phones and internet. We are glued to our mobile phones and other electronic devices, and we give less time to our family and friends and social circles. Perhaps there's a silver lining in the cloud that if machines started working for us, we will have more time to spend with each other. The human touch will be resurrected and so on. So would you agree with me on this or not?
I don't know, needless to say, what the preferences of future generation will be, whether they will want to spend most of the time in their metaverse or whether they will want us to invest more in technologies that, automate things like cleaning and tedious household work and things that we don't like to do. And, we spend more time traveling and being with friends and doing things that, we feel give us meaning. I have absolutely no way of knowing that. I do think that there is a real risk surrounding the addiction of some of these technologies, especially for younger people. And I think there's compelling evidence that social media platforms have been partly a cause of depression, particularly among teenage girls. And I do worry about that, and I think we need to try to design a policy that I'm not sure if restricting the use of those technologies is the right way to go, but at least making sure that algorithms are not designed to be addictive, I think is a reasonable way to start. If we do that, I'm generally optimistic that people will make decisions that improve their own lives rather than reduce their own utility. But unfortunately, I have no profound insights how people will choose to spend their time in the future. My general impression is that, Zoom and these technologies work quite well, but we are sort of tired after sitting in front of a computer screen all day, and we rather meet up at the football game or go to the pub or meet in the theater and do things that we've done for a long time. And I don't think that is coming to an end anytime soon.
Mr. Gal, thank you so much for your time. I had a very interesting conversation and very insightful points I got from your conversation. In the last, I would ask you if you have a message for the researchers and young lot in Pakistan regarding this idea and what they can further research on regarding this domain in the future. So if you would like to something to our audience in the last.
Well, I think understanding how attitudes change in response to new technologies and how that shape economic and technological development is a very unresearched topics, and I would certainly encourage you to look into that more. I do think that more work on what the institutions that support service-led development rather than manufacturing-led development, what they look like, and how Pakistan can prosper in an age of service-led globalization, especially now with the rise of remote work and the potential for a new wave of offshoring, because if a job can be done remotely, it can also be offshored, and I think that will offer new opportunities for a country like Pakistan. So I do think that is something very worthwhile looking into.
Thank you, Mr. Gal.
Thanks for having me, and I hope to meet you in person in Pakistan sometime in the future.
Yes, sure. We will be happy to host you. Whenever you land in Islamabad, just inform us. We will be your host. Thank you. Until we meet next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a
Thank
good
you
day.
so much. Thank you.